All right, John, so great to finally get you onto the podcast. We've been planning this out for far too long, but just as a way of intro for anyone who is just getting to know you right now, let's go back to the very beginning for you. Tell everyone who's listening a little bit about your background and your journey to all the amazing things that we're going to talk about today, from Sovereign's Capital to the book Good Money to everything else in your life. But how did this
Yeah.
all begin for you?
Yeah. Alexander, thanks so much for having me on. It's a privilege to be with you all. So, going all the way back, I was born in Gainesville, Florida, actually. At the time, my dad was in college, but he was making a living as a rodeo cowboy. So, he rode bulls and saddle bronc horses in the rodeo. My mom cut hair. So, I had a very country music song beginning. We moved around a bit when I was a kid and then ended up settling in a town called Columbus, Georgia, which is just about an hour and a half south of Atlanta. My dad ended up as a financial advisor over time, which was how I got exposed to the finance industry. And I had a pretty typical upbringing as a kid. Columbus is kind of a mid-sized town. I had two little brothers. Was always kind of a political science nerd and public speaking nerd. So I got really into writing and those sorts of things. Went to school at a small school called Berry College in Northwest Georgia, which is in Rome, Georgia. Absolutely gorgeous place I've stayed in touch with over time. Largest college campus in the world at 28,000 acres. So I had plenty of room to roam as an undergrad. And again, stayed really involved in kind of economics and political science over that time. Actually thought after I graduated that I might go into the think tank world or be a journalist or an academic. And that summer after I graduated, I decided I might as well try business. So I literally bought the Volt Guide to Consulting, I remember, and started like Googling around for what other people were doing and ended up applying to consulting. And one of the consulting firms had an energy trading wing attached. I was losing my apartment from my summer job in a couple of weeks. So I ended up in my first job out of college really as a quantitative energy trader, which sounds awesome and really impressive until I admit that I was the world's worst quantitative energy trader. But that was my introduction to investment management. Bounced from there to McKinsey after a year and did McKinsey and Company for a couple of years. Really enjoyed that because it was my first real introduction to business, seeing different business models. I got to live abroad some, which I'd never done growing up as a kid, lived in Saudi Arabia, later lived in Afghanistan and London with McKinsey at different times. In between McKinsey stints, went to business school and public policy school. And there I continued this kind of dual interest in political science, public policy, and business. I spent one summer during the great financial crisis while I was at HBS in the Kennedy School at a housing finance nonprofit because of everything that was going on. And then spent one summer at Bridgewater Associates, the hedge fund. When I came back to McKinsey, I did those international things, got to experiment with a few other things, and then ended up committing to investment management after 2 years after graduate school. Worked for Invesco, a very large multinational asset manager, for 9 years. Was their chief strategy officer a while, then oversaw private markets for them and global institutional client. And then 5 years ago, made a transition into Sovereign's Capital, which I know we'll talk about, which was more of a startup investment management firm. And then the only other thing worth mentioning, since you brought it up in the intro, is over time I've also maintained this interest in writing. So I've written 5 books. Many of those are kind of on leadership, purpose, human flourishing. So with Harvard Business Review Press, I've done 3 books now really focused on this idea of purpose and human flourishing, which now also intersects a lot with what I do at Sovereign's Capital. So there's been a nice intersection of those things the last 5 years that's been really fulfilling.
So, John, your background and resume is just so darned impressive. You're talking about some of the most prestigious institutions in the business world, McKinsey, Bridgewater, like and you've got just this incredible background in analysis and business and everything. But you're so driven by purpose with that now too. I'm curious, when you were at those institutions, did you have this sense of purpose and values driving what you were doing there? Or is that something that came to you over time as you were building up this pedigree?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's kind of a both and response to that. I grew up as a person of faith in the church, and so this idea of calling and purpose and mission was always really important to me, and I always sought that in various parts of my life. At work, it took me some time to figure out how those things intersected. So as a leader, I always got a great deal of purpose out of developing a team, seeing people succeed in their goals, trying to lead in a way that was values oriented. But I hadn't quite figured out how to work that into my day job until 5 years ago with Sovereigns. And I've had this great desire over time to now what I would call see human flourishing in the world, to create opportunity. I used to call it opportunity creation because I felt so grateful for the opportunities I'd received. I grew up, it's a great American success story. When I was born, we lived in a single wide trailer in a trailer park, and I got to go do all these amazing things, right? And I thought, man, there is so much talent in the world that's untapped. How do we help people feel really fulfilled in the work that they do, in the lives that they lead? And how do we unleash that talent that's resident within everyone in the world, right? Because I had felt that others had offered me that opportunity. And so that's where my initial focus on that began, as well as just a real longing in my own life to feel a sense of mission. And I'd say I started digging into that in earnest when I wrote my first book for HBR 15 years ago. We were grad students, we were coming out of the great financial crisis, and we wrote this book on next generation leadership called Passion and Purpose. And one of the themes that emerged from that was the desire of people in my generation to not just achieve financial success, but to really live lives of meaning. And that became a thread of my research and writing over the next 15 years. And so it was really providential for me when I was able to join a firm that incorporated that. The funny thing, if anybody asks the question, do I take my writing seriously? Part of my career transition was actually in writing my last book, which was the HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose, which is about perfect purpose in life and at work. And I got convicted as I was writing that I wasn't really living as fully into this idea of mission in the work that I was doing as I could. So when I left Invesco in May of 2020, I had about 8 months of transition where I was working through client handoffs and stuff, but I had this time to reflect on what is the next phase of my career going to look like. I was heading into what I thought was the peak of my career, entering my 40s, and I thought I really want this to be a pivot point for me where it's even more integrated. And there was a long journey there over about 8 months, figuring out what that looked like. And when I found Sovereigns, it really ticked all the boxes for me. I was ready to do something entrepreneurial. Sovereigns has an explicit thesis. We're a faith-driven investment firm of baking human flourishing into the way that we run our companies. And it was just like a light went off for me that I could be fully integrated with these things I had cared about so much, and this thing I enjoyed doing, investing. And now that I'm getting to do that every day, it's like every day I wake up, not just able to try and execute that thesis in the companies that we represent and the limited partners that we represent, but also help push the boundaries on what does that mean? How do we develop frameworks around it? How can we spread these practices to other firms? And so I feel like those two areas of my life are probably more intersected than they've ever been.
I hear this from a lot of people who in the investment and business world who are purpose driven now, that it's something they started to realize over time they weren't fully living out. But once they realize that, they go all in and driving their businesses that way and what they do. And so what I love about what you're doing with Sovereigns Capital and what we do at Liberty Ventures is help entrepreneurs especially just start from that purpose driven sense of what they're doing and understanding what their own values are to stay committed to it. And so I want to double click on just how Sovereigns Capital really approaches that, because I see so many similarities between the Liberty Ventures approach, which is about advancing the principles of capitalism and liberty, and those being the underlying values, with letting entrepreneurs figure out how to develop them. And I think it's the same thing with how Sovereigns Capital approaches with the faith-based set of values. Is that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to affirm one thing you said really quickly about getting entrepreneurs to lean into it earlier. Some of us learn slowly. I tell young people today, get in there early. I have a tagline sometimes I say, which is there is no success without significance. There's this success to significance framework that people have in society. It's like, I'm going to make a lot of money, and then later in my career, I'm going to try and do some good stuff with that money. And my point of view is like, why waste all that time? Like, just lean into it right away. You only need so much money, and that will probably happen if you love what you do and you're good at what you do, but lean into significance. At Sovereigns, we are an explicitly Christian, faith-oriented firm. Most of our limited partners, though not all, are faith-aligned institutions or families. And the way that that materializes in our thesis, so our mission is to love God and love our neighbor through investing. There's a God part of that, obviously, that we take seriously. But this idea of love of neighbor is really about trying to create flourishing in the limited partners that we work with and in the companies that we work with.
Mm,
We're still refining and pushing what that thesis means, but we've gravitated on one side to a theoretical framework that's actually out of Harvard. So the Harvard Program on Human Flourishing, led by a guy named Tyler Vanderweel, actually works in coordination with Gallup, the pollster, and Baylor University as well. But Tyler has proposed this six-part framework on human flourishing. So it involves happiness and life satisfaction, just how do you feel about your life? It involves meaning and purpose. Do you feel like your life has an impact, a positive impact on others? It involves physical, mental, and spiritual health. So, are you healthy comprehensively? It includes financial and material stability, which is a slightly different category because it's a means, not an ends, which I talk about in the book quite a lot. And includes close personal relationships. So, do you get fulfillment from the relationships you have in your life, and character and virtue? Are you living in a way that you feel is aligned with the values that you hold? We're now stacking practices that we try and bake into companies aligned against those different criteria, right? So for physical, mental, and spiritual health, we do things like look at whether chaplaincy is available or care teams are available to provide for the mental and spiritual health of team members. We look at benefits policies and whether you have things that encourage physical and mental wellness in your benefits policies. For things like character and virtue, that might look like leadership training, mentorship training. For meaning and purpose, that might look at the values and mission of the organization and whether those are baked into the practices of the organization. And for things like financial and material stability, that might be broad-based shareholder ownership. It might be assuring that there are market wages paid throughout the company, et cetera. So there are a variety of practices that we tick through. And those we then seek to either emphasize in the companies that we're buying, because many of them already have those. And they're the types of programs that many private equity firms or venture capitalists would be reticent to embrace because they do involve some additional costs sometimes. We hold tightly to those and try and roll out new practices. And the thesis is that if we can serve people that way, that we can build cultures that can outperform over time. So there's a lot of research out of London Business School, McKinsey, and others that great cultures outperform poor cultures. So even if you were just financially motivated, you'd want to try and build those. And the practices that we're building in, we think, help improve safety incidents. They typically attract better talent. They retain talent better. And by building cultures that do so, our hope is that we can have an impact thesis that's not at all in conflict with our financial goals for that and serving limited partners well. And so that's kind of part of how we piece that together to create flourishing in a portfolio.
So I'm completely on board with the strategy here. It comes from my time with conscious capitalism and belief there that culture beats strategy every day. You need strategy as well, but with too many companies ignore culture and that being a key influence in the success of business and having that purpose behind it. So can you give an example of one of your portfolio companies and how this embodies the philosophy and the strategy of Sovereign's Capital?
Yeah, for sure. So we have one fire organization, for example, Brindley Mountain Fire Services. So it used to be the largest seller, purchaser, and servicer of used fire trucks in America. We at one point used that to acquire one of the biggest private wildfire defense companies in America. So those that serve private communities or small municipalities that can't afford fire departments or can't orchestrate them. And they bake a lot of these practices in. So they have a mission, vision, values that employees are tightly aligned to. They have benefits policies that are aligned with what we think of as like family-friendly family formation policies. So things like adoption benefits and things like maternity and paternity leave so that people can dedicate time to families. They have funds for employees in crisis. So we call these employee benevolence funds. I'll give an example from a different portfolio company. And they have things like chaplaincy, and the individual stories that come out of that are really powerful. So for example, we just had that group talk at our fund manager gathering where we invite about 130 GPs like us to just come trade notes on the practices that they use to build these things. And we had the fire services team come up and talk. And they had emphasized a really tragic situation where one of their employees had lost a young child in a tragic accident. Terrible situation. And the team at Brindley was really able to rally around this person. Losing a child is probably the worst thing that can happen to a person, or among the worst things. And so the family was distraught. They didn't have a lot of financial means. They didn't know how to orchestrate a funeral, to deal with the emotions of it. Anybody who's lost someone knows that that's a challenging time. The chaplain was right there with them. Their managers were right there with them. They were the first group to rally around them. They helped them orchestrate the funeral. They helped make sure they had the funds to pay for everything so it wouldn't cause financial distress. And they really orchestrated counseling for those family members so that in this lowest point of their lives, they didn't feel like they were alone, that the team really rallied around them, formally and informally, because the employees who were so missional, also, they were there at the funeral. They were rallying around this person. And that's a very individualized example of how that works. And Brindley does other things as well. But, at the heart of culture is what happens to individuals, and what people believe about will happen to them in the organizations in which they exist. We had a different organization. We get notes all the time because we stand up these things called employee benevolence programs. These are funds that you establish for employees in crisis. They come out of these old church benevolence programs. They're either funded by the company, or at Sovereigns, we've set up one at the GP level that companies can draw on if they don't have the resources to do so. And then you can allow employees to contribute, but they're typically seated by the leaders of the organization. We had one portfolio company recently where they were pulling from the GP fund, actually, where a young lady, single mom, had a medical crisis that caused her not to be able to pay her rent for a period of time. And she was about to lose her home. Single mom with kids, just going through a medical crisis. She applied to this employee benevolence program, and we were able to basically pay her rent for 3 months while she was trying to get back on her feet in the midst of this. And she sends us this note where she says, like, no one else was there for me in this financial crisis. Like, I was struggling. I thought I was alone. And the idea that the company I work for would be the only people there for me while I was going through crisis just blew my mind. And that as a person makes me fulfilled, because I'm like, gosh, we got to do something really important. And if you think about the culture of the firm, those stories build a culture. And that person is now thinking of that firm differently than if it were just a transactional relationship that we had for them. And so those are the types of ways that those practices, I think, impact individuals.
John, those are some beautiful stories and really do illustrate the power of the right culture to promote flourishing in companies. And I think anyone can see how that will help the company's bottom line as well when you develop the commitments and the relationships with your employees, your team, your stakeholders for that. And want to use that as a segue to talk about some of the big lessons from your books. And by the time this podcast comes out, your new book that has been released, I'm sure, Good Money. So what are some of the underlying themes of what you've written up to this point, and how does your new book, Good Money, build on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 3 books I've written for HBR all involve purpose at some level. That first I mentioned was Passion and Purpose. It was about young leadership, next generation leadership. 5 years ago, I published something called the HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose. So those little books you see on newsstands. So it was a sole authored thing where I articulated how you can build purpose into your work and life effectively, how you seek meaning in your work and life. And about 3 years ago, I started to think about the intersection of this topic of human flourishing and money, right? I felt there were some good books coming out. Morgan Housel has a great book on that. Psychology of Money has a new book on spending. Elizabeth Norton had a book come out called Happy Money, but they were a bit incomplete in my mind because they didn't address money comprehensively. And they often talked about things like happiness rather than human flourishing. And happiness and human flourishing are a bit different. And so I thought, man, with all this research I've done on human flourishing and this experience I have around money all the time, right? Like I work with wealthy families all the time. I've seen money do really bad things for families. I've seen it do really good things for families. So I knew money can actually be good or bad, which is something that most people don't recognize. Like today in American society in particular, there's this idea that like more money is always good. But if you talk to any wealthy person, you know that it also comes with unique temptations and downsides. It can actually it can partially destroy human flourishing. And even the Human Flourishing Program, which I mentioned earlier, their first survey came out of, I believe it was 200,000 or 300,000 people around the world. And one of their findings was that the wealthiest societies actually ranked regularly lower on human flourishing as a composite score than poor and middle income societies that weren't in conflict, so where there wasn't a war or something like that. So there was actually an inverse relationship between national prosperity and these measures of human flourishing about relationships, culture. So I thought someone needs to write about the intersection of a framework for human flourishing and how to use money well. And so that was the initiation of this book, Good Money. And what I try and do there is break down the research to help people understand the role money plays in flourishing. There really is a means, not an end. You pursue relationships, character, meaning, and purpose for their own sake, and you can't have too much of them. Money is actually just an enabler to those things. And actually, the research would show if you pursue that as an end, it can crowd out those other more meaningful things in life and become destructive. Something where the modern research lines up with a lot of ancient wisdom, whether that's in different faith traditions or different philosophers, that if you get too obsessed with money, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, Timothy says, that it can actually become a distraction from the more meaningful things in life. And so I set the right mindsets around it. Then I have this framework where I work through each of the ways in which you intersect with money. So earning it, how you bring it in, spending it, what you spend on, and which of those are good and bad. Generosity, giving money away, philanthropy, how you can improve the world and improve yourself through generosity, and investing, and the way you dictate your investment dollars. And then I have this kind of screed against retirement as one of the final pieces of that framework, because I think retirement is actually unhealthy for people largely. And then address money and kids as a final chapter. So how to weave that in. And so the intent is to try and help people understand a framework for human flourishing, like the one I worked through earlier, and how money intersects with that and where it can be destructive of that and how you can make it supportive of that.
And I can see how this ties in with what we were talking about earlier on in the episode, where it's so important for entrepreneurs when starting their businesses to think about what their purpose and their values are and imbue it from the very beginning. It's not just about making money in the business, but why they're doing it, what the significance is there. And it sounds like you're talking about that at the personal level as well in Good Money, not just at the business level.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the concepts we look at in the book that's somewhat controversial in some sectors is this idea of setting a financial finish line, which is defining a lifestyle that you think is positive for you and your family. And then just basically saying, after that, I'm not accumulating to get more stuff. I don't need more houses. I don't need nicer cars, whatever. So I'm going to set a net worth target or an annual income target that supports that lifestyle. And every dollar beyond that, I'm going to dedicate to investing in meaningful businesses or to giving to philanthropy or doing something worthwhile that's not just accumulation for myself. And there are obviously in our world, there are great examples of that. One of my partners, Casey Crawford, runs a company called Movement Mortgage. He was a tight end in the NFL, started this company, set a financial finish line, and basically he calls it retired like 15 years ago because of how the business was successful. And now every additional dollar in Movement either goes back into his companies or it goes to his philanthropies, which build charter schools and churches and help centers and things like that. And so he's still incredibly motivated because he's seeing the growth of these businesses support all these meaningful things that he's trying to do in the world, but it's not really going back to him in a way. So he stepped off this treadmill and avoid something in psychology we call hedonic adaptation, which is basically where you get used to a lifestyle and then you want a little bit more, which is what we're all tempted to. And it's not just Christians who think that way. Like in some ways, differently, you can look at guys like Elon Musk as embracing a similar framework where the guy doesn't seem to really invest in his own lifestyle that much. Those additional dollars often comprehensively go into these businesses he's building that he thinks are improving the world, right? He's kind of got a lifestyle he's comfortable with. Every bit of his energy and money is dedicated towards building these businesses or some of the philanthropies that he supports. And so that kind of concept for an entrepreneur, I think, can be helpful because a lot of people think, hey, if I just set a finish line and I say no more money for myself, how am I going to be motivated? Am I just going to get bored? And it's like, no, that kind of liberates you to think about all the other things you can do with that aren't so focused on yourself, right? That you can do that build something that impacts the world. So that's some of what we even talk with our entrepreneurs about as they're growing companies.
John, I just absolutely love this message. I love what you're doing with Sovereign's Capital and so excited that you're going to be speaking at our executive summit coming up in Atlanta in just a couple of months. And so really appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit about what you're doing right now as a preview for that here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be with you all in person. I know you've got an incredible community, and so I'm grateful to be a part of that and part of the show today.
Awesome. Well, thank you, John. Love to have you back on in a little bit.